She was just the gardener to the silent billionaire until he spoke her name. Before we start the story, leave a comment and tell us which city you're watching from. And don't forget to rate the story from 0 to 10 at the end. Enjoy the story.
The iron gates of the Ashworth Estate groaned open like a sigh from a forgotten time. For Annie Connor, the sound was a melody of homecoming and trepidation. She gripped the steering wheel of her beat-up pickup truck, her knuckles white, and guided the vehicle down a long, winding driveway flanked by ancient, weeping oak trees. Sunlight struggled to pierce the thick canopy, dappling the overgrown path in shifting patterns of light and shadow. This place was more than a job to her. It was a ghost story, a family legend. Her grandfather had been the head gardener here for 40 years, back when the estate was a beacon of life and laughter, when the Thorne family name was synonymous with brilliance, not tragedy. He had spoken of the gardens as if they were a living, breathing entity, a masterpiece of color, scent, and design. The garden Annie saw now was a beautiful ruin. Roses, once meticulously pruned, now grew wild and thorny, their blood-red petals a stark contrast to the creeping ivy that choked the stone walls. The grand fountain at the center of the drive was silent, its basin filled with rainwater and fallen leaves. The estate wasn't dead, she thought, but it was sleeping, a deep, sorrowful sleep. Her job, as outlined in a series of curt emails from a law firm, was simple: restore the gardens. No timeline, no budget constraints, just a single cryptic instruction signed by the estate's trustee. Bring them back to what they once were. She was met at the grand, imposing front door by a woman who seemed as carved from stone as the house itself. Mrs. Albright, the head housekeeper, was a tall, severe woman in her late 60s, with gray hair pulled into a tight, unforgiving bun. Her eyes, the color of a winter sky, assessed Annie from head to toe, taking in her worn work boots, simple jeans, and the dirt permanently etched under her fingernails. "Miss Connor," she said, her voice crisp and devoid of warmth, "welcome to Ashworth. The rules here are few, but they are absolute." She led Annie through a cavernous, dust-sheeted foyer where the air was cold and still. "You will have full access to the grounds and the greenhouses. Your supplies will be delivered as requested. You will not, under any circumstances, enter the main house beyond this foyer unless expressly invited, which you will not be." "I understand," Annie nodded, her own voice feeling small in the echoing space. "And the most important rule," Mrs. Albright continued, her gaze sharpening, "concerns Mr. Thorne. You are not to approach him. You are not to speak to him. If you happen to see him through a window, you will avert your gaze and continue your work. He values his privacy above all else. Is that clear?" "Perfectly," Annie said, though her heart was pounding. Julian Thorne, the silent billionaire, the boy her grandfather had once described as having fire and genius in his eyes, a brilliant architect who at 30 had been poised to change the world. Then the fire, a horrific blaze that had consumed the east wing of the manor, his studio, and his beloved wife, Amelia. Julian had survived, pulled from the wreckage without a single burn, but something inside him had been extinguished. For 2 years he had not been seen. He had not spoken a single word. He was a ghost in his own kingdom, a king presiding over an empire of silence and memory. Her first days were spent in solitude, learning the language of the forgotten garden. She found the bones of her grandfather's design hidden beneath the chaos, the ghost of a path, the outline of a forgotten flower bed. She worked from dawn till dusk, her hands sore, her muscles aching, but her spirit soared. With every weed she pulled, every branch she pruned, she felt like she was helping the estate to breathe again. She never saw him, but she felt him. a flicker of movement behind a curtain in a second-story window, the faint, melancholic sound of a piano being played in the dead of night, a single, broken chord repeated over and over. He was a presence, a weight in the air. To combat the profound loneliness of the place, she began to speak to the garden, just as her grandfather had. "All right, you stubborn thing. I know you think you belong here, but there's no room for all this bitterness. We're going for beauty now." One afternoon, while working on a bed of faded hydrangeas beneath the large windows of what she guessed was the library, she spoke without thinking. He used to say these were his wife's favorites. He said she loved how they held on to their color, even after they were gone. She froze, realizing she had spoken of Julian's wife, the source of his silent pain. Her cheeks flushed with embarrassment, and she quickly glanced up at the dark window, her heart catching in her throat. For a single, breathtaking second, she thought she saw a silhouette in the dim light, a tall figure standing back from the glass, watching. She held her breath, but the shadow was gone as quickly as it had appeared. Shaking her head, she told herself it was a trick of the light, a figment of her overactive imagination. But as she returned to her work, a strange feeling settled over her. The silence from the house no longer felt empty. It felt attentive. She had a distinct, impossible feeling that she was no longer talking to herself. She just had to have faith that somewhere, behind the stone and silence, someone was listening. Weeks bled into a month, and under Annie Connor's devoted care, the garden began to awaken. The scent of freshly turned earth and blooming jasmine replaced the stale smell of decay. The first defiant crimson bloom of a restored rosebush felt like a victory, a heartbeat returning to the dormant estate. Annie's days fell into a rhythm, punctuated by the snip of her shears, the scrape of her trowel, and the one-sided conversations she now held without reservation. She had accepted the silence from the house as not an emptiness, but as a form of listening. It emboldened her. She told the garden and its unseen resident everything. "I know used to say that a garden knows when it's loved," she confessed one afternoon, carefully separating the tangled roots of a forgotten peony. "I hope you can feel it. I'm trying to do right by you. By his memory." She paused, wiping a bead of sweat from her brow. "He always wanted to come back here. He'd tell me stories about the Thorne family, about a boy with a mind that built worlds on paper. He said that boy deserved a garden that could keep up with his imagination."
Her biggest challenge was the maze, a sprawling, high-hedged labyrinth at the far end of the property that was once the estate's crowning jewel. Now it was an impassable fortress of overgrown yew, the paths completely lost to time and neglect. Annie had her grandfather's old leather-bound journal, filled with sketches and notes, but the pages detailing the maze's design were water-damaged and illegible. For days she stood at its entrance, utterly stumped, her tools lying useless at her feet. "I've got to admit, you've got me beat," she said one evening, addressing the looming, shadowy library window. "My grandpa's notes are a mess. I can't find the entrance, the true path. It's like you built a puzzle even you couldn't solve." She sighed, a puff of white in the cooling air. "Or maybe it's not meant to be solved. Maybe some things are meant to be left lost." Defeated, she packed up her tools and headed back to the small cottage on the edge of the grounds that served as her quarters. The next morning, something was different. Lying on the weathered stone bench beside the labyrinth's entrance was a large, rolled-up cylinder of paper tied with a simple black ribbon. It hadn't been there last night. Her heart began to hammer against her ribs. With trembling fingers, she untied the ribbon and carefully unrolled the paper. It was a blueprint, an original architectural drawing of the estate gardens, rendered in impossibly fine, precise ink lines. The paper was old and brittle, but the design was breathtakingly clear.
Her eyes scanned the intricate details until they found it, the labyrinth. Every twist, every turn, every dead end was mapped out with genius-level clarity. But it was the small, fresh marking in the corner that made her breath catch. A single, elegant circle had been drawn in soft graphite around a small, almost invisible break in the hedge, far from the main archway she had assumed was the entrance. Next to it, 2 words were written in the same sharp architectural script as the original plans, yet the pencil mark was new, dark, and definite. The real beginning. It was a message, a reply, a piece of him given to her. He hadn't just been listening, he had been engaging, collaborating. This silent, broken man had reached out from his stone fortress to help her. A profound, aching intimacy washed over her. It was a secret shared between 2 people who had never met, a conversation held without a single spoken word. Clutching the blueprint to her chest, she looked up at the library window, a slow, brilliant smile spreading across her face. She didn't need to see him to know he was there. She raised her hand in a small, grateful wave. Later that day, as she successfully navigated the labyrinth's true entrance, Mrs. Albright appeared at her side as silently as a ghost. The housekeeper's eyes took in the remarkable progress, then landed on the blueprint Annie had spread out on the ground. "Where did you get that?" Mrs. Albright's voice was sharp, suspicious. Annie's mind raced. "I found it, in one of the old sheds, tucked away in a corner." The housekeeper stared at her for a long, unnerving moment. Her expression was unreadable, but a flicker of something, doubt perhaps, even a grudging respect, passed through her eyes before the stone mask returned. "Be that as it may, Miss Connor, remember the rules." She turned and walked away, her posture rigid. But Annie didn't feel chastised. She felt thrilled. Their secret was safe. The silent conversation had begun, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that this was only the beginning of something far more important than restoring a garden. It was about reaching the man lost inside. The blueprint changed everything. It was no longer just Annie's work, it was their collaboration. Following Julian's precise, elegant lines, she began to carve a path through the overgrown labyrinth. As she worked, she narrated her progress, her voice carrying on the gentle breeze toward the silent manor. "You know, your sense of perspective is brilliant," she said one afternoon, pausing to admire a newly cleared walkway that created a stunning visual illusion, making the path seem longer than it was. "My grandpa would have called this pure genius. He would have said you were a poet who built with stone and leaf." She didn't expect a reply, not an ink or graphite one. But that evening, as twilight painted the sky in shades of violet and rose, a reply came in music. The faint, broken piano chord she'd heard before was gone. In its place, a melody drifted from the open library window. A piece she didn't recognize, but one that was filled with a profound, aching melancholy. It was complex, beautiful, and deliberate. It wasn't the sound of someone aimlessly pressing keys. It was the sound of someone communicating. Annie slowly lowered her tools, her heart swelling. A tear she didn't know she was holding back slipped down her cheek. He was playing for her. This was their new language. And so, a new routine was born. She would work in the garden, her efforts a testament to life and renewal. And as the day ended, he would play, his music a response, a reflection of the beauty she was coaxing back into his world. Sometimes the melodies were somber, echoing the estate's sorrowful past. Other times they were lighter, almost hopeful, as if her presence was letting a little bit of sun into his shadowed soul. One week, a violent storm rolled in, threatening to undo months of her hard work. Winds howled and rain lashed down in blinding sheets. Annie, unable to stay in her cottage, pulled on her rain slicker and rushed out into the maelstrom. Her biggest concern was a delicate climbing rose she had just planted against a trellis directly beneath the library window, a rare breed her grandfather had written about, called the Amelia rose. As she fought against the wind, trying to secure the fragile branches with twine, a blinding flash of lightning split the sky. For a single, electrifying second, the library was illuminated as brightly as if it were day. And she saw him. He was standing right there, just feet away on the other side of the glass. He wasn't a shadow or a silhouette. He was real. Tall and disheveled, with dark hair falling across his brow and a beard that did little to hide the sharp, handsome lines of his face. But it was his eyes that stole her breath. They were a deep, piercing blue, and they were filled with a storm of their own, a tempest of grief, pain, and something else, something that looked impossibly like longing. Their eyes met through the rain-streaked pane. The world stopped. There was no wind, no rain, no thunder. Only his gaze locked on hers. It was a moment of pure, shattering connection. Two lonely souls seeing each other with perfect clarity. Then, just as quickly, another flash of lightning plunged the world back into darkness. When the next one came, he was gone. Annie stood frozen, soaked to the bone, her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She no longer felt the cold. She felt only the searing heat of his gaze. The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the world washed clean. As Annie approached the trellis, she saw that the Amelia rose had survived, and resting on the stone bench beside it, where the blueprint had once been, was another offering. It was a small silver locket, caked with dirt and tarnished with soot, as if it had been pulled from ash. With trembling hands, she picked it up. The clasp was stiff, but she managed to pry it open. One side was empty, the silver inside blackened and warped by heat. But the other side held a tiny, miraculously preserved portrait of a woman with a radiant smile and eyes that crinkled at the corners. It was a face full of life and love. Annie knew without a doubt who it was. Amelia, his wife. This was no longer a conversation about a garden. He was sharing his grief, offering her the most broken piece of his heart. As she clutched the locket, Mrs. Albright's voice cut through the morning stillness, sharper than usual. "Miss Connor." The housekeeper stood a few feet away, her eyes fixed on the locket in her hand. A look of genuine alarm crossed her features. "Some things," she said, her voice low and tense, "are better left buried in the ashes." Without another word, she turned and walked stiffly back toward the house, leaving Annie with the cold silver locket in the chilling realization that the fire had taken far more than just a life. It had left behind secrets that even the stone walls were afraid to speak of. Annie spent the rest of the day with the locket tucked safely in her pocket, its cool silver a constant, heavy reminder of the secrets the estate held. Back in her cottage that evening, she gently cleaned it with a soft cloth, polishing away the layers of soot and grime until the silver gleamed under the lamplight. It felt like an act of profound intimacy, of tending to a wound. She felt a fierce, protective surge for the man in the house and a deep-seated fear of the shadows that surrounded him. The next afternoon, the fragile peace was broken by the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. It wasn't a delivery truck. A low-slung, gleaming black sports car, so modern it looked alien against the backdrop of the old manor, purred to a stop. A man in a tailored, expensive suit stepped out. He was handsome in a sharp, predatory way, with slicked back hair and a smile that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. Annie, working near the front entrance, instinctively straightened up, her hand closing around her trowel. Mrs. Albright emerged from the house before the man could even knock, her posture even more rigid than usual. "Marcus," she said, her voice a thin, hard line, "you were not expected." "I never am, Eleanor," Marcus replied with a condescending smirk. He glanced around at the burgeoning life in the garden, his eyes finally landing on Annie. He gave her a slow, dismissive once-over. "I see the trustee has hired some help, trying to put lipstick on a pig. Are we?"
Ignoring the insult, Annie averted her gaze as instructed, focusing on a non-existent weed. But she listened, every nerve on high alert. "He does not take visitors," Mrs. Albright stated. "He's my cousin," Marcus snapped, his charming facade cracking for a second. "I have a right to see the state of our family's assets." He brushed past the housekeeper and disappeared into the house. A palpable tension settled over the estate. Annie tried to continue her work, but her focus was gone. Her eyes kept drifting to the library window. 20 minutes passed, then the music started. It wasn't the melancholic, beautiful melody of their silent conversations. It was a chaotic, discordant mess, a furious slamming of keys, chords clashing against each other in a symphony of pure anguish. It was a scream for help. It was the sound of a mind unraveling. Annie dropped her trowel. Her heart pounded in her chest. The music was a raw, unfiltered broadcast of Julian's torment. Something was terribly wrong. Suddenly, the discordant noise stopped. It was replaced by a deafening silence, followed by the distinct, sickening sound of shattering glass. Every rule, every instruction from Mrs. Albright evaporated from her mind. There was only one thought: "I have to get to him." She sprinted across the lawn, her muddy boots leaving tracks on the pristine stone steps of the front terrace. She didn't bother with the door. She ran to the library's French windows, the ones she had stood beneath in the storm, and peered inside. The scene was one of devastation. A crystal decanter lay shattered on the floor in a pool of amber liquid. Books had been swept from the shelves. And in the center of the room, Julian was on his knees, his hands pressed against his temples, his body trembling violently. His eyes were wide, staring at a point on the wall but seeing nothing. He was gasping for air, lost in a world she couldn't see. She didn't hesitate. She tested the handle of the French door. Unlocked. She slipped inside, her heart aching at the sight of his complete and utter agony. "Julian?" she whispered. He didn't react. He was trapped in the inferno of his own memory, seeing ghosts. She knew instinctively that touching him might make it worse. She had to anchor him to the present, to their world. She had to use their language. "Julian," she said again, her voice soft but steady, like the gentle rain after a storm. "It's Annie, the gardener. The Amelia Rose. It survived the storm. It has a new bud. It's a deep, beautiful red." He flinched, the name Amelia a fresh wound. "The labyrinth. The path is clear now. I found the center. There's a stone bench there, just like on the blueprint. It's quiet, peaceful." She kept talking, her words painting a picture of the life and beauty she had cultivated outside his window, the world they had built together in silence. She spoke of the scent of the jasmine, the color of the hydrangeas, the strength of the old oaks. She was grounding him, pulling him back from the ashes, one word at a time. Slowly, agonizingly, the violent trembling began to subside. His ragged gasps softened into deep, shuddering breaths. The haunted, vacant look in his eyes began to recede, replaced by a dawning, exhausted awareness. His gaze, no longer seeing ghosts, shifted and found her.
He stared at her as if seeing her for the first time, not through a rain-streaked window, but here, in the heart of his sanctuary, his prison. His lips parted, a rough, unused sound catching in his throat. He tried again, forcing the sound past 2 years of silence, 2 years of suffocating grief. His voice was a raw, broken whisper, the sound of a lock rusting open. Annie. Connor. The impossible had happened. He had spoken her name. Hearing her name in his voice, a sound rough and raw from disuse, was like a physical blow. It wasn't just a word, it was an acknowledgement, a bridge built across an impossible chasm of silence and sorrow. Annie's breath hitched, and tears she hadn't realized were forming spilled down her cheeks. All she could do was nod, a silent affirmation. Yes, I'm here. Julian's gaze held hers, his piercing blue eyes filled with a maelstrom of confusion, exhaustion, and a flicker of something she had only seen through the window pane. A desperate, profound connection. The effort of speaking seemed to have drained the last of his strength. He swayed, and Annie instantly rushed forward, catching his arm to steady him. The touch was electric. His skin was warm, real. He was no longer a ghost behind the glass.
Just as her fingers wrapped around his arm, the library door was flung open. Marcus stood there, his face a mask of fury. Behind him, Mrs. Albright looked pale, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. "What is the meaning of this?" Marcus snarled, his eyes darting from Annie's hand on Julian's arm to his cousin's dazed expression. "Eleanor, I told you to keep the help out of the house." He strode into the room, his expensive shoes crunching on the shattered glass. "Look at the state of him," he said with a cruel, triumphant sneer, gesturing at Julian. "Completely gone, unfit to manage his own affairs, let alone this estate. This is exactly what I needed." The unspoken truth hung heavy in the air. This visit wasn't a family check-in, it was an assessment. Marcus was gathering evidence to have Julian declared incompetent, a move that would undoubtedly make him the trustee of the Thorne fortune. Before Annie could react, Mrs. Albright moved with a speed that belied her age. She stepped between Marcus and Julian, her body a rigid protective shield. For the first time, Annie saw not just a severe housekeeper, but a fierce guardian. "Get out!" she said, her voice low and trembling with a rage that seemed to have been simmering for years. Marcus laughed. "Don't be ridiculous, Eleanor. You're just the staff. You have no authority." "This is Mr. Thorne's home," she cut him off, her voice ringing with an iron will. "And as long as I am in charge of it, you will not harass him. You will not torment him. You will leave these grounds immediately, or I will call the police and have you removed for trespassing." The sheer force of her conviction seemed to stun Marcus into silence. He stared at her, then at Julian, who was now leaning slightly against Annie, his gaze fixed on his cousin with a dawning, cold clarity. The vulnerability in his eyes was being replaced by the ghost of the powerful man he once was. Defeated for now, Marcus backed away, his face twisting into an ugly sneer. "I'm not finished here," he spat, pointing a finger at them. "None of you." He turned and stormed out of the house, the slam of the front door echoing like a gunshot. A heavy silence descended upon the library, broken only by Julian's ragged breathing. Annie looked at Mrs. Albright, expecting a reprimand, an order to leave. Instead, the housekeeper's stern facade finally crumbled. Her shoulders slumped, and a deep, weary sigh escaped her. She turned, her eyes landing on Annie's hand, which was still firmly supporting Julian's arm. The housekeeper looked at Annie, not with anger, but with a complex mix of despair and gratitude. "Marcus has been trying to seize control since the day of the fire. He sees this tragedy not as a loss, but as an opportunity. I have tried to protect Julian, to keep the world out, but the silence wasn't enough." Her gaze softened as she looked at Annie. I gave you rules to keep him safe, to maintain the quiet. I never imagined—" She trailed off, her eyes flicking to Julian. "I never imagined the quiet was what was truly hurting him." It was a confession, an admission that her rigid protection had become another kind of prison. "He needs more than a guardian," Mrs. Albright whispered, her eyes meeting Annie's. "He needs an ally." In that moment, the lines of employer and employee, of rule-maker and rule-breaker, dissolved. They were three people bound by a shared purpose to protect the man standing between them. Annie felt Julian's hand move under hers, his fingers weakly but deliberately curled around her own. It was a silent plea, an anchor in the storm. She tightened her grip, a silent promise in return. "I won't leave you." She looked up at Julian, who was watching her, his expression raw and vulnerable. For 2 years, he had been lost in a world of silent grief. Now, for the first time, he wasn't alone in it. Annie was no longer just the gardener who tended the forgotten roses. She had stepped out of the garden and into the heart of the storm, and she knew she would not, could not leave his side until it passed. The echo of the slammed door faded, leaving a ringing silence in its wake. The adrenaline that had surged through the room receded, revealing the profound fragility of the man at its center. Julian's entire body trembled with the aftershocks of his panic attack and the monumental effort of speech. The strength that had held him upright vanished, and he sagged, his weight becoming heavy against Annie's arm. "Let's get him to a chair," Mrs. Albright said, her voice soft but practical, her focus entirely on Julian's well-being. Together, she and Annie guided him to a large, worn leather armchair near the fireplace. He sank into it, his head falling back against the cushions, his eyes closing in sheer exhaustion. He looked like a man who had run a marathon after years of being bedridden. Annie stood awkwardly for a moment, suddenly aware that she was in a room she was forbidden to enter, her muddy boots a stark violation on the priceless oriental rug. I should go," she stammered, backing away. "No," a voice stopped her. It was Julian's. Hoarse, quiet but firm. His eyes were still closed, but the single word was an undeniable command. Mrs. Albright nodded in agreement, a silent treaty passing between her and Annie. "He's right. Please stay." She then did something that felt more shocking to Annie than Julian speaking. She broke her own sacred rules. "Miss Connor, Annie, would you mind putting the kettle on? The kitchen is through that door. I think some tea is in order." It was an invitation not only into the kitchen, but into the inner circle of the house. It was an act of trust.
While Annie was gone, Mrs. Albright knelt by Julian's chair, dabbing his forehead with a cool cloth she had retrieved. "She's a good woman, Julian," she murmured, more to herself than to him, just like her grandfather. When Annie returned with a tray bearing a steaming teapot and 3 cups, she found Julian sitting up, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames in the fireplace. The wild, haunted look was gone, replaced by a deep, bone-deep weariness. He watched as she poured the tea, his movements slow and deliberate as he took the cup she offered. His hand was surprisingly steady. Mrs. Albright took her cup and, with a final, meaningful look at the two of them, gave a small nod and quietly left the room, closing the heavy doors behind her. She was leaving them alone, granting them the privacy they had earned. For a long time they sat in a comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the clink of porcelain. The quiet was different now. It wasn't an absence or a prison. It was a shared space, a peaceful respite. Finally, Julian spoke, his voice still rough, but clearer now. Marcus, he always saw the estate as a balance sheet, numbers on a page. He never understood. He turned his head to look at her,
his blue eyes holding a universe of unspoken pain. He never saw the life in it. I see it, I replied softly. I see it every day. A faint, sad smile touched Julian's lips. You know I do. He took a slow sip of tea, gathering his thoughts. The silence, it wasn't just the grief. After the fire, the world became too loud. Every voice was a question. Every look was pity. Silence was a shield, a place to hide where nothing else could hurt me. What changed? She whispered, her heart aching for him. His gaze was direct, unwavering, and it sent a shiver through her. You. He set his cup down. You didn't ask questions. You didn't stare with pity. You just came into the quiet and planted flowers. You talked to the garden. You talked to me, even when you thought I couldn't hear. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to an intense whisper. You have no idea what your voice sounded like from inside that darkness, Annie. It was the only thing that felt real. It was a thread, pulling me back. The raw honesty of his confession left her breathless. All those months of one-sided conversations, of sharing her simple thoughts with the flowers and the windows, had been a lifeline. Marcus said my wife's name, Julian continued, his jaw tightening as the memory returned. He was talking about her insurance policy. That's when the noise came back. The fire, the screaming, the shattering glass. I'm so sorry, Julian, she said, her hand instinctively reaching out to rest on his, at the dirt etched into her skin from her work in his garden. He slowly turned his hand over and laced his fingers through hers. His grip was a confirmation of everything that had passed between them in silence. The fire wasn't an accident, he said, his voice dropping to a near inaudible whisper, fraught with a terrible certainty. I don't remember how I know, I just know, and Marcus was there. The air in the room grew cold. This wasn't just about Marcus trying to steal an inheritance from a broken man. This was darker, more dangerous. Annie looked into his eyes and saw the fear, but she also saw a new, steely resolve. The silence had been his shield, but now he had something to fight for. He had a reason to speak. And as she sat there, their hands intertwined, she knew her job was no longer just about restoring a garden. It was about helping the man beside her reclaim his voice, uncover the truth, and find a way to live again, not in the silence, but in the world they were beginning to build together. The days that followed were a delicate dance on new, unsteady ground. Julian's voice, once broken free, did not come easily. Speaking was a physical effort, his words often slow and measured, as if he had to relearn the shape of each one. Some days he would retreat into long stretches of silence, not out of pain, but out of a comfortable, shared quiet with Annie. He was a man recalibrating himself to the world, and she was his anchor. A new routine formed, one that Mrs. Albright quietly orchestrated. Annie still spent her mornings in the garden, finding solace and purpose in the familiar work, but her afternoons were now spent inside the house, in the vast, sun-drenched library that had become their sanctuary. She would read aloud from her grandfather's old gardening books, while Julian listened, his eyes closed, sometimes sketching idly on a pad of paper, abstract lines and shapes that seemed to map an internal landscape. Mrs. Albright would bring them trays of sandwiches and tea, her severe expression softening whenever she saw them together. "He hasn't had an appetite in 2 years," she confided in Annie one day in the kitchen, her voice thick with emotion. "Now he asks if you will be joining him for lunch. You're bringing more than the garden back to life, my dear." Their conversations were a mosaic of small moments and profound revelations. Annie told him about her simple life, her dreams of one day owning a small nursery. Julian, in turn, offered fragmented memories of his past, like pieces of a shattered mirror. He spoke of his love for architecture, the joy of creating something beautiful and lasting from nothing. But he never spoke of his wife, and he never spoke of the fire. The locket Annie had found remained a silent testament to the grief that was still too raw to touch. His conviction that Marcus was involved in the fire, however, was an unshakable, intuitive truth. "It's a feeling," he tried to explain one afternoon, his frustration evident as he struggled to find the words. "A darkness. When he's near, it's like the air gets cold. It's the same feeling I had that night." He looked at her, his expression desperate. "Does that sound insane?" "No," Annie said firmly, her belief in him absolute. "It sounds like you remember something your mind won't let you see yet." They knew they couldn't go to the police with just a feeling. Marcus was clever, powerful, and he had spent 2 years consolidating his position and building a narrative of Julian as an unstable recluse. They needed proof. "The investigation reports," Julian murmured, staring into the fire. "The official cause of the fire was faulty wiring in my studio, an accident. But I designed that wing myself. The wiring was flawless, shielded, state-of-the-art. It makes no sense." "Could Marcus have had access to the reports, to the investigation?" Annie asked. Julian gave a humorless laugh. "As my concerned next of kin, he had access to everything. He managed it all while I was gone." A chilling thought occurred to Annie. If he was involved, he would have made sure any evidence was buried. They were at a dead end. Marcus had controlled the narrative, the evidence, and the aftermath. Frustration hung heavy in the air. Julian stood up and began to pace, his movements agitated, the silence threatening to reclaim him. Seeing his distress, Annie stood as well, placing a gentle hand on his arm. "Julian," she said softly. He stopped, looking down at her, his breathing unsteady. "Maybe we're looking in the wrong place. We've been looking at the story Marcus told the world. What if we look at the place where the real story happened?" His toddy tensed. "What are you saying?" "The East Wing," she whispered, her heart aching at the fear that flashed in his eyes. "It's been sealed off since that night, untouched. Maybe the answer isn't in a file. Maybe it's still in there, in the ashes." The thought was terrifying. It was the heart of his trauma, a place of ghosts and nightmares. He took a step back, shaking his head, the old shield of silence descending around him. He couldn't go back there. Annie didn't push. She simply held his gaze, her own eyes filled with an unwavering strength and compassion. "You don't have to," she said gently. "But you're not alone anymore, Julian. If you decide to face it, I'll be right there with you." She left him then, giving him space to breathe, and returned to the garden as the sun began to set. She didn't know if he would follow. She didn't know if he could. She only knew that she had opened a door for him. Whether he walked through it was up to him. An hour later, as twilight settled over the estate, the library's French door opened. Julian stepped out onto the terrace. He was wearing a heavy coat, and in his hand he held a large, old-fashioned iron key. His face was pale, his jaw set, but his eyes were clear and determined. He walked toward her, his steps sure and steady, and stopped just before her. He didn't say a word. He simply held out the key. Annie looked from the key to his eyes and understood. It was the key to the sealed East Wing. He was ready to face the ghosts, together. She reached out, and her fingers brushed against his as she took the cold, heavy key, its weight a promise of the burden they were now choosing to share. The lock on the east wing door was stiff with rust and disuse. It took both of Julian's hands to turn the heavy iron key. The sound of the tumblers grinding open was unnervingly loud in the twilight, the sound of violation against the 2 years of solemn silence. The door groaned open, releasing a blast of cold, stale air that smelled of soot, damp, and sorrow.
Side by side, they stepped over the threshold, from a world of gentle healing into a cathedral of ash. The fire's devastation was absolute. Moonlight streamed through the skeletal remains of the roof, casting long, eerie shadows across a landscape of black and gray. Everything was coated in a thick layer of soot that muffled their footsteps. It was a place frozen in the last violent moments of its life. Ghostly imprints on the walls showed where paintings had once hung. Melted silver had pooled and hardened on the floor like metallic tears. Annie reached for Julian's hand, her fingers finding his in the darkness. He gripped it tightly, his knuckles white, but he didn't pull away. He walked forward, his steps slow and deliberate, a man walking through his own grave. This had been his world, his architectural studio. The skeletal frame of a massive drafting table stood warped in the center of the room. Charred blueprints, their elegant lines now just black smudges, were scattered on the floor. In a corner, a bronze sculpture he had been working on was half melted, its form twisted into an expression of agony. "This was my sanctuary," Julian whispered, his voice thick with a grief so profound it was almost tangible. "The one place I felt truly alive. He took it all." As they moved deeper, they entered what had clearly been a sitting room adjoining the studio. A charred piano stood against one wall, its keys like yellowed, broken teeth. And on a soot-stained nightstand beside the ghostly outline of a sofa, Annie saw it. A small, blackened jewelry box, its lid warped open from the heat. She stopped, her breath catching. Her fingers went to her pocket, to the cool silver of the locket. This is where it had been. This was Amelia's. Julian's gaze followed hers. He stared at the empty, scorched box, and a shudder racked his entire body. The air grew thick, the smell of smoke suddenly sharp and real in his mind. "Julian?" Annie said, her voice a lifeline. But he was gone. His eyes, wide and unseeing, were looking back in time. Heat, the acrid smell of turpentine, not paint. Shouting, Amelia's voice, sharp with an anger he had never heard. "You can't, Marcus. It's fraud. I found the offshore accounts. I'll tell him everything." Marcus's laugh, cold and dismissive. "He's my blood. You think he'll choose you, the little artist with a bleeding heart, over his family?" A shove. The sound of Amelia crying out, not in pain, but in shock. A heavy glass lamp toppling over, shattering against the hardwood floor. A pool of oil spreading. And then the flicker. A tiny flame that grew with terrifying speed, feeding on the turpentine Marcus had used to clean a canvas just moments before. Amelia, trapped behind a wall of fire. And Marcus standing in the doorway, his face illuminated by the growing inferno. No panic, no fear, just a cold, final calculation. He watched for a moment and turned and walked away, leaving the fire to erase his crime. Julian gasped, stumbling backward, the memory crashing into the present. He wasn't just feeling it anymore. He was seeing it. He was there. "The lamp," he choked out, pointing with a trembling finger. He pushed her. The lamp fell, but it wasn't an accident. The turpentine, he used it as an accelerant." He looked at Annie, his eyes wild but lucid. The fog had lifted, revealing a horrifying, crystal-clear truth.
"He murdered her," he whispered. "He stood there and watched her die." The raw agony in his voice was a physical blow, but Annie held her ground, her grip on his hand a grounding force. "Then the proof has to be here, Julian," she said, her own voice shaking but filled with a fierce resolve. "If he planned this, he might have made a mistake, something he overlooked." Fueled by a new righteous fury, they began to search. They were no longer walking through a tomb, they were examining a crime scene. Julian, his architect's mind re-engaging, scanned the room, his eyes seeing not just the destruction, but the structure beneath it. "The floorboards," he said suddenly, kneeling near where the lamp had fallen. He ran his hand over the charred wood. "This part of the floor is newer, oak. I had it replaced a month before the fire. The original floor had a small, fireproof safe embedded in the floor for Amelia to store her documents. He wouldn't have known." Together they pried at the warped boards with a rusted fireplace poker. Beneath them, covered in soot and debris, was a small, square metal door, its surface blackened and buckled, but its seal unbroken. It took all of Julian's strength to force the damaged lock. Inside, miraculously preserved, was a leather-bound folder. Annie lifted it out, her hands trembling as she opened it. It was filled with papers, bank statements, transfer logs, offshore account numbers. It was everything. Amelia's meticulous proof of Marcus's multi-million-dollar embezzlement scheme from the Thorne Company. This was the motive. This was the evidence that would not only prove Marcus was a thief, but a cold-blooded murderer.
They stood up, the folder clutched between them. The ghosts of the East Wing were no longer screaming in torment. They were crying out for justice. Julian looked at Annie, the moonlight catching the tears on his face, but his eyes were no longer filled with brokenness. They were filled with the fire that Marcus had tried so hard to extinguish. "Let's go," he said, his voice no longer a whisper, but the steady, resolute command of a man who had found his purpose. "Let's make him pay." They walked back from the East Wing in a heavy, determined silence, the leather-bound folder a tangible weight between them. The moonlight that had once seemed mournful now felt like a spotlight, illuminating their path forward. The air was no longer thick with ghosts, but with the cold, clear purpose of justice. Mrs. Albright was waiting for them in the library, a sentinel silhouetted against the firelight. She didn't need to ask what they had found. The grim resolve on their faces told the story. Her eyes fell to the folder in Annie's hands, and a lifetime of suspicion settled into a painful certainty. "Amelia," the housekeeper whispered, her voice cracking for the first time. "She tried to tell me. She said he was a viper. I told her to be careful. I never imagined." "You couldn't have known," Julian said, his voice steady, devoid of the tremor it had held just hours before. The broken man was gone, replaced by the focused, formidable CEO he once was. But now, we all know, and we know what we have to do. He laid the folder on the grand mahogany desk, its contents a testament to his wife's bravery and his cousin's treachery. For the next hour, the library transformed from a sanctuary into a war room. The three of them, an unlikely trio, the reclusive billionaire, the loyal housekeeper, and the determined gardener, plotted their next move. "We can't just go to the police," Julian stated, pacing before the fireplace. "Not yet. Marcus is a cornered animal, but a powerful one. He has lawyers, connections. He'll bury this in litigation for years, claim these documents are forgeries, that I'm mentally unstable. He's had 2 years to build his narrative. We need more than evidence of his past crimes. We need to catch him in the present." "How?" Annie asked, her gaze fixed on him. She was seeing a new side of Julian, the brilliant strategic mind her grandfather had described. A cold, dangerous light glinted in Julian's eyes. "We use his own sins against him, greed and arrogance. He thinks I'm a broken shell, and he thinks you," he said, turning to Annie, "are an insignificant gardener. He will underestimate us. That will be his downfall." The plan he outlined was simple, elegant, and ruthless. The next morning, an official-looking letter, drafted on the estate's finest stationery, was dispatched by courier to Marcus Thorne's downtown office. It was a formal notice from Julian's legal team, a firm Marcus didn't know he had secretly retained, stating that Julian was contesting Marcus's control over his financial affairs and demanding a full audit. It was a declaration of war. As they waited, the tension in the house was a palpable force. Every passing car on the distant road made them flinch. But late that afternoon, the inevitable happened. Julian's private unlisted phone, which had been silent for 2 years, rang. The caller ID read, "Marcus Thorne." Julian looked at Annie, took a deep breath, and answered, putting the call on speaker. "Julian, is that really you? I heard you were communicating. I was so worried after what happened the other day." "Save it, Marcus. I know what you've been doing. I know what you did." A beat of silence on the other end. "I don't know what you're talking about. You're clearly not well." "I found Amelia's folder," Julian cut in, the words a perfectly thrown dagger. The silence that followed was heavy with guilt and panic. "That's impossible," he finally stammered, his composure shattering. "That safe was buried. The whole wing was destroyed." "Not everything burned," Julian said, his voice low and menacing. "I have it all, Marcus. The police are going to find it very interesting. Unless, of course, you'd rather discuss the settlement. My silence has a price." It was the perfect bait. Julian was speaking Marcus's own language, the language of deals, leverage, and greed. "Don't do anything stupid, Julian," Marcus warned, his voice a desperate hiss. "Where are you? We can talk about this, in person." "My house, tonight, at 9. Come alone. And Marcus," he added a final, chilling note in his voice, "don't ever underestimate me again."
He ended the call, the final click echoing in the silent library. Annie's heart was hammering. The trap was set. The Viper was on his way back to the scene of his crime, drawn in by the belief that he could still buy his way out of murder. As evening fell, Annie and Julian stood by the library window, looking out at the gardens she had so lovingly restored. The roses were in full bloom, their beauty a stark contrast to the darkness that was about to descend upon the house. "Are you ready for this?" she asked softly, her hand finding his. He turned to her, his blue eyes clear and unwavering as he squeezed her hand. "She deserved justice," he said, "and we are going to give it to her." Right on cue, a pair of sharp predatory headlights cut through the twilight at the far end of the long driveway. He was here. The final act was about to begin. The library was cast in shadows, the only light coming from the low, flickering flames in the grand fireplace. Julian stood by the mantel, a silhouette of calm resolve. Annie was a few feet away, near the desk where the folder lay, a quiet anchor in the tense atmosphere.
They didn't have to wait long. The heavy doors opened without a knock, and Marcus strode in. He had shed his pretense of concern, replaced now by a sharp, businesslike aggression. He carried a leather briefcase, and his eyes immediately scanned the room, assessing threats, calculating angles. "All right, Julian," he began, his voice devoid of any warmth. "Let's stop this foolishness. You've made your point. You found some old papers. Now let's talk numbers. How much will it take to make this folder and your sudden memories disappear?" He glanced at Annie with dismissive contempt. "And I'll need an NDA from the gardener. A generous one, of course. She can go back to whatever miserable life she had before this." Annie flinched, but Julian didn't even blink. He simply looked at his cousin with a cold, unnerving pity. "You still think this is about money," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the weight of the entire room. "You think everything and everyone has a price." "Don't be naive," Marcus scoffed, opening his briefcase on the desk. "It's the only thing that's real. Now name your price." Julian took a slow step forward, his eyes locking onto Marcus's. "There is no price for my wife's life." "Amelia's death was a tragic accident," Marcus snapped, his composure finally starting to fray. "The official report—" "The report you helped orchestrate," Julian countered, his voice like steel. "The one that mentioned faulty wiring. That was clever. But you overlooked something." He took another step, closing the distance between them. "You overlooked the turpentine." The color drained from Marcus's face. It was a single, devastating detail that wasn't in any report, a detail only someone who was there could know. The arrogant mask crumbled, revealing the panicked murderer beneath. You couldn't possibly remember that," he stammered. "I remember everything now. I remember her telling you she knew about the embezzlement. I remember you pushing her. I remember the lamp shattering, and I remember you standing in the doorway, watching the flames as if you were watching a problem being solved." "She would have ruined us," Marcus finally screamed, his control completely gone. It was a full confession, spat out in a torrent of jealousy and rage. "She was a nobody, a sentimental artist who was going to tear down everything our family built. You were weak, blinded by her. I did what needed to be done to protect our legacy, to protect what should have been mine." He lunged forward, his hands reaching for the folder on the desk. "You will not destroy me with the scribblings of a dead woman." But before he could touch it, the library's main doors swung open silently. 2 uniformed police officers stepped inside, followed by a detective in a long coat. Mrs. Albright stood behind them, her face pale but resolute. She had made the call the moment Marcus's car had arrived, just as they planned. The detective's voice was calm and final. "Marcus Thorne, you are under arrest for the murder of Amelia Thorne." Marcus froze, his face a grotesque mask of disbelief and fury. He whipped around to look at Julian, his eyes wild with betrayal. "You!" Julian didn't flinch. He simply stood beside Annie, his hand finding hers, their fingers intertwining. The battle was over. Justice, silent for 2 long years, had finally found its voice.
6 months later. The Ashworth Estate was no longer a place of ghosts. It was a place of life. Sunlight streamed through the sparkling clean windows of the main house, and the sound of laughter could often be heard echoing from the gardens. The gardens themselves were a masterpiece, a breathtaking symphony of color and life that had surpassed even their former glory. Annie, her hands in the soil, looked up as Julian walked toward her, no longer a silent, broken billionaire, but the man she loved. He carried a basket filled with fresh bread and cheese, and a blanket was tucked under his arm. He spread the blanket on a patch of lush green grass near the now gurgling fountain. The east wing, in the distance, was no longer a charred ruin. It was a scaffold-covered work in progress, being slowly, carefully rebuilt. It would not be a studio this time, but a public gallery and conservatory in Amelia's name, a place of beauty for everyone to enjoy. "Lunch is served, Miss Connor," Julian said, his smile reaching the brilliant blue of his eyes. Annie laughed, wiping the dirt from her hands as she sat beside him. "You know," she said, leaning her head on his shoulder, "my grandfather always said that a garden needs 3 things to grow: sun, water, and a reason to bloom." Julian wrapped his arm around her, pulling her close. He looked around at the vibrant life that surrounded them, the life they had nurtured back from the ashes, both in the garden and in themselves. "I guess we both just needed to find our reason," he whispered, before leaning in to kiss her, a gentle, loving promise under the warm afternoon sun. And in the peaceful quiet of the garden, amidst the scent of roses and the promise of a new beginning, they knew they were finally home. The story of Annie and Julian is a beautiful reminder that sometimes the most profound connections are built not with words, but with unwavering patience and compassion. A simple act of kindness, tending to a forgotten garden, blossomed into a love that healed the deepest wounds and brought a lost soul back into the light. What did you think of their incredible journey? Do you believe that true love can heal even the most broken person? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to rate this story from 0 to 10. Your score helps us know what stories you love the most. If this story touched your heart, please show your support by giving it a like and subscribing to our channel for more emotional and inspiring tales. Make sure to click the notification bell so you never miss a new upload.